Thanks very much for talking to us today about songwriting. I'm interested in where it all began, or maybe where the thought that you might write songs in the first place came from. And I believe in your childhood you came from a quite poor background, but a culturally rich one.
Yeah, it was quite unusual. I didn't really have that kind of like stereotypical upbringing. I wasn't kind of brought up in a mining village, but at the same time my family was kind of abjectly poor. But my parents were both, my dad was a classical music obsessive and my mum was an artist. So even though we didn't have any money, it was kind of like, everything we owned was made, or kind of, if you wanted a picture or a pair of trousers, you'd make them yourself. Right. So I always had that kind of sense of creativity, I suppose, that sense that if you want something, you make it yourself. So when I got to the stage where I wanted a song that I didn't seem to be able to buy at a record shop, I thought I'd try and make it myself. So yeah, the example was set to you early on that creativity is something to aspire to or something to be involved in. Something that's accessible and something that you can do. Making something was always something that me and my family did. So when it came to making music, it just seemed kind of quite a natural thing to do. Even though I wasn't like a trained musician, it just seemed part of the process of expressing yourself. What about, what records? You had an older sister, and I believe that she went away to art college and left her record collection. Pretty much, yeah. And I seem to remember the Beatles being mentioned, maybe David Bowie, maybe Roxy Music. Yeah, all of those things, all of those kind of classic 70s things that, at the time, this was, when I was kind of a teenager in the 80s, that kind of musical archaeology, that culture of musical archaeology didn't exist, and now you have publications like Mojo and all those sorts of things that kind of remind people of classic records. And at those times, once records had passed, the 1980s was a very different thing. They were forgotten about. And, my friends were listening to Howard Jones and Human League and stuff like that, and I was sort of listening to the Beatles and 70s rock and Dylan and stuff like that. So instantly that was unusual to an extent at that time. It kind of was at the time. It's sort of like you have to sort of see it in context. So I think now it doesn't seem that unusual, but I think it probably was at the time. It did feel like a bit of an oddball, yeah. I'm also interested in this, the place you grew up in, Haywards Heath. And this is it's not that interesting. Well, that's interesting in itself. This idea of a place which was I guess everywheresville. It was a strange place, Haywards Heath. It's a suburban town. And it has all of the kind of frustrations that I think that are inherent in places like that, And I did always feel the need to escape. I did never really feel like it was home, to be honest. I always felt like, I used to go to the railway station, look up the tracks to London, and kind of like dream of the big city, that old cliche, And I think a lot of interesting music has come out of the suburbs. There's sort of tension in the suburbs that there isn't, maybe a different sort of tension than there is in the inner city. Thinking about how you might start, because you've then much further down the line you've carved out this sound which is really unique, but you don't. I imagine when you write your first song, you don't start off with anything unique. I would have thought that you start off by maybe copying the songs you like. Is that how you started? Very much so, yeah. I think, everyone has to kind of like grow into their own style, and, there's no other way to do it, unless you're some sort of freak of nature. You don't suddenly arrive fully formed and with your own style. You kind of like, you take the pieces of things that you love, and, bands like the Smiths and the Sex Pistols and Bowie and all of those sorts of things, I kind of, moulded into my thing, and it kind of became me. And now I don't feel particularly like an amalgamation of those things. I sort of feel very confident just to write as Brett Anderson, and I think I've sort of developed my own style. But that takes a while. It does take a while, and every young band is kind of like, it's very obvious where they get the parts that make them up from. But that's to do with developing musical confidence as well. Sure, and then at some point it comes to the point where creativity just takes over. Exactly, and you just let it flow, and it just kind of like comes out, and you're not thinking, oh, I want this to sound like that, or I want it to sound like. You just do it, and it comes out, and that's an interesting breakthrough with the creative process, where you do feel quite sort of naturalistic about it. But can you remember the moment when you felt this is something which no one else has done? Well, I mean, writing the first Suede album was a really, really exciting moment and time, because it did feel like we were doing something very, very unique and original. And even though you can look at it as an amalgamation of various styles, I do think it was it's very much its own thing. And it was quite a powerful musical manifesto, because it kind of pretty much led on to what became Britpop, even though it wasn't called that at the time, and even though that phrase is rather, I find rather limiting, and I'm not particularly comfortable with it. It was a powerful thing. And I remember sort of sitting there with Bernard writing things like The Drowners and Pantomime Horse, and a song like we're going to play in a bit called The Next Life, and kind of thinking, no one else is doing this, and that was a really incredibly exciting thing to be kind of a part of. And I remember Bernard sort of starting to, for the first time that I was aware of, to start playing the piano and some of the parts that he was writing. Because he wasn't a kind of trained piano player, there was something really beautiful about their naivety. And for me, The Next Life really captures that, because I think he told me once that it was inspired by a Beethoven piece, Moonlight Sonata or something. I might be wrong, but you know, it's that thing, that moment when someone's not completely comfortable with an instrument, that they come up with something really quite magical.
Something special, because I guess because they're not falling on their own cliches.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But that's quite interesting for the whole idea of songwriting, because Bernard Butler is considered the great guitarist, and here he is working out a song on an instrument which he probably doesn't feel that comfortable with. So it sort of brings it points out the fact that songwriting isn't necessarily about virtuosity.
I think absolutely not. It's really not. It's about inspiration, and it's whatever angle you can approach inspiration from.
What inspired The Next Life lyrically?
It's a funny one, The Next Life, because at the time I thought I'd written it about kind of my ex-girlfriend and about the termination of our relationship, and kind of almost equating it with the death of someone. And it wasn't really till years later that I realised that I wrote it about the death of my mother. And it's such a strange idea that you can write a song and actually the writer doesn't know what it's about. You know, I can see it with perspective now, but at the time it was just such a overwhelmingly unhappy experience for me. You know, like the death of any parent is, that I couldn't really see what I was writing about. I was kind of writing almost with my subconscious.
Are you happy to play it?
Let's play it.
Great.
Yeah.